Hello, everyone, and Merry Christmas. I hope you are doing well this week and that you've got all your Christmas shopping done. I am in my home office today instead of my church office, so the background isn't my cool bookshelves, but this very nondescript picture of a pier. Where's the pier from? I have no idea. I used to have this really great print of a Gustave Doré etching from the book of Ezekiel and the Valley of Dry Bones. But my wife, it's not exactly her style, and she uses the home office more than I do now because of COVID. So she's moved that over to that wall. It's got lots of skeletons and skulls, and it looks a little bit like an Iron Maiden album. So not exactly her style, but thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it and look forward to diving into a little bit more of the book of Exodus. If you remember last week, I talked about it being a little bit of a bridge week. We've talked about Abraham, and this week we're talking about Moses. Last week we talked about three individual characters in the Bible narrative that get us from Abraham to Moses. Actually, one of them was Moses. Talked about Jacob and how as one of the sons of Isaac, God chose him, even though he was the younger son, to be the channel through which the Abrahamic blessings would continue and would flow. And that is so that God's purposes and election would stand. He says that Jacob I have loved and Esau I have hated. We move on from Jacob to his sons, and he's got 12 of them. One of his sons, his second to youngest son, Joseph, is hated by his other brothers. He does seem a little bit annoying, but they sell him into slavery. He ends up rising in Egypt to become second in terms of power in Egypt, which was part of God's plan. His brothers meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. It was the way that God not only saved the people of Egypt from a massive famine, but saved Jacob and his other sons from the same famine. God had revealed to him that this famine was coming and had advised Pharaoh on how to store up grain to sustain them through the years of famine. That ends the story in Genesis, and Joseph and his brothers are living in Egypt, which God had told Abraham was going to happen, that he had promised him seed. And at the end of Genesis, we see that the seed is developing, it's expanding, it's growing. Blessing, and we see throughout the whole Old Testament how that is coming to fruition, but it really points us ahead to Jesus. And land. The land promise wasn't going to be fulfilled in Abraham's lifetime, not even in the lifetime of his sons, but 4 generations later, God was going to bring the people of Israel out of a land that they were sojourning in and were serving as slaves back to the promised land that he had promised to Abraham. Moses is how that ends up happening. Moses is among those people of Israel who were born into slavery in Egypt, and God miraculously delivered him from death. Pharaoh had ordered that all the Hebrew baby boys would be slaughtered because the people were growing so numerous. But his mother put him in a reed basket and sent him floating down the Nile, only to be found by Pharaoh's daughter. And he's raised in Pharaoh's household with all the privileges that go along with being a part of Pharaoh's household, the education, just everything that goes along with that. But apparently he knows that he's not Egyptian. He knows he's a Hebrew. And one day he's walking among the Hebrews and he sees an Egyptian beating and abusing the Hebrew slaves. And he rises up against this Egyptian and kills him. He thinks that no one has seen this, but apparently 2 other Hebrew people have seen this. When he learns that his murder is not as secret as he thinks, he flees Egypt and goes to the land of Midian. And it's during this time that he's in the land of Midian that we'll pick up the story. But one thing I want to clarify. We've talked about several different covenants, and today we'll talk about the Mosaic Covenant. But when a new covenant is cut, remember that's the kind of Hebrew phrase for it, you cut a covenant, that doesn't replace the old covenant. These covenants kind of stack up on top of each other and build on one another. So the Abrahamic covenant is built on the groundwork of the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant was a covenant of preservation, and it was universal. The Abrahamic covenant wouldn't have been possible without that earlier covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant is more focused on redemption and salvation, more focused on a unique people, a one family. And then the Mosaic covenant, which we'll talk about today, builds on that. Doesn't replace it, but builds on it. And so today we're going to read a little bit from Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. If you have a Bible, fantastic. If not, I'll read it here and make comment. I've got my nice pulpit kind of Bibles are all at church, and my giant study Bibles are what I have here at home. But this is Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Okay, so Moses is in Midian, the land of Midian, which is where he fled after Egypt. He's taking care of the flocks, and he comes upon a bush that is on fire but not being consumed. And that will certainly get your attention. Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight. Yeah, I'd do that too. Why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take off your sandals, for your place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. See here, as God is calling Moses to be the one who would go and not redeem the people, but lead the people out of Egypt, he's connecting this directly to the promises that he had made previously to Abraham. I am the God of Abraham. I'm the God that made these promises, and I'm continuing to be faithful to them. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them out of the land to a good land, and a broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. These are the people who God had told Abraham, eventually I'll bring you in and give you this land, but their sin isn't yet filled. So there's the delay of 400 years while the sin of the Amorites and the Canaanites fill up. And now behold, it continues, the cry of the people of Israel has come up to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you. This is God speaking. But I will be with you, and this shall be a sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain, Mount Horeb. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is God's covenantal name that God is revealing for the first time here to his people, Yahweh. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And God said to Moses, and he said, Say this to the people, I am has sent me to you. Part of God's covenant working with his people is a special revelation, not just of his will, but of his very nature and of his covenantal name, Yahweh, I am. So we know the story from here. Moses does go back to Egypt with his brother-in-law Aaron. Moses pleads that he's not a good speaker. He's not eloquent of speech. So God says, fine, take Aaron with you. Apparently he's done Toastmasters and can speak better. So they both go. They gain audience with Pharaoh and demand that Pharaoh let the Hebrews go so that they can worship God on the mountain of the Lord. You can almost imagine Pharaoh snickering at this and saying, no, I'm not going to do that. This is my labor force. The security, the prosperity of Egypt depends on these slaves. So God arranges to send several plagues upon the Egyptian people. The first plague was turning the Nile into blood, to where it looked like blood. The magicians in Pharaoh's court are able to replicate through demonic power, magic, this miracle. And so Pharaoh is unconvinced. The second plague is frogs. The magicians, again, can replicate this. But they begin to see that it's not trickery. They say that this is the finger of God doing this. But Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Sometimes, you see kind of Pharaoh's fickleness. Sometimes he's so fed up with the frogs or the locusts or the hailstorms or whatever. He says, fine, get the people and take them out. Leave. You're free. But he always changes his mind. It's interesting to read different understandings, different ways that people take these plagues. Some try to explain the plagues as kind of natural phenomenon. Maybe there was a volcanic eruption. Maybe this is kind of the natural thing that happens when the Nile floods, whatever. And I'm not saying that there aren't natural explanations in part behind these, but you cannot use natural explanations to detract from the fact that these are miraculous. God is ordering, God is ordaining these plagues as judgments upon Egypt. Others, interestingly, look at these plagues as kind of polemic against Egypt's gods. Matter of fact, in Exodus 12:12, God does say that I'm sending judgment on Egypt's gods. And you can look at each one of these plagues, or at least most of these plagues, and see a direct connection between the judgment that God is pouring out on Egypt and one of their gods. So, for example, Osiris is the god of the Nile, and the flooding of the Nile was typically associated with the resurrection of Osiris. So, the Nile turning to blood is a way of signaling Osiris is dead. Osiris is meaningless. Osiris has no power. And you can go through most of the plagues and see a kind of correlation between the Egyptian pantheon and these plagues. Whatever the explanation is, this is the hand of God, not just in judgment on Egypt, but as a means of delivering his people. There is the final plague of the death of the firstborn and the death angel who comes through Egypt, and only the Israelite people are saved, and that in a very specific way. Through sacrifice and through the blood that they put on the doorpost of each Israelite household, of each Hebrew's household. And when the death angel saw the blood there, he would pass over that household. Eventually, as people in Pharaoh's own household are struck dead, this gets his attention, and he says, fine, I don't want to see any more of you, Moses. Get your people and go. And the text of Exodus tells us that 600 men left the next day. 600 men carrying basically plunder. They looted Egypt on their way out. 600, did I say 600 men? 600,000 men, not counting women and children. And it says, and a mixed multitude went with them. So people from other nations, including other Egyptians, went with the people of Israel as they exited Egypt. Again, Pharaoh's heart is fickle in this, and he changes his mind, and he decides to give pursuit to the fleeing Hebrew people. And the Hebrews come between a rock and a hard place, or actually a wet place in Pharaoh's armies. They're backs are against the Red Sea, and Pharaoh is chasing. And again, God miraculously delivers and pours out wrath on Pharaoh's armies. As Israel walks across on dry land, God parts the Red Sea so that they can do that. And as Egypt's armies pursue, the Red Sea comes crashing down, and Egypt's army, Pharaoh's army, drowns in pursuit. So God has brought his people in fulfillment of his promises out of Egypt and is preparing to bring them into the promised land. But in the meantime, as they're in the wilderness of Sinai, they come to the mountain of Sinai, where God strikes a covenant, not just with a person here, but with the nation of Israel. This is basically the rest of Exodus is this covenant and the details of this covenant. That's an oversimplification. But in Exodus chapter 19, that's actually, I meant to read that a long time ago. In Exodus chapter 19, we read these words. Then Moses went up to God, up to Mount Sinai, and the Lord called from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you were to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." In a way, this becomes the vocational calling of Israel, and I'll say more about that in a minute. This covenant that God is striking with Israel follows a very typical treaty kind of covenant that you would see in the ancient Near East, particularly the Hittite Suzerain treaties. Archaeologists have uncovered these treaties, and the Mosaic Covenant really does follow this pretty tightly. In a Hittite Suzerain treaty, you'd have basically 6 important elements. There was the fact that the treaty was initiated by the sovereign, by the king. It wasn't really negotiated. The people didn't come and say, "Hey, can we have a treaty?" It was imposed on them from the sovereign, the king, the Hittite king. There was responsibilities for both parties. Usually it would be that the Hittite king would provide protection in the terms of like fortified cities for the people, and the people would work his land and serve him faithfully. There was a preamble to the covenant treaty in which both parties were named, and a historic prologue in which the details of what the king had done for the people is laid out. And that's what I think we just read in Exodus 19. Kind of this prologue. I am the Lord your God. I am Yahweh. That's my covenant name. You're my people. This is what I've done. I brought you out of Egypt on eagle's wings. There's preamble. This is the historical dialogue. There's stipulations, blessings, and curses. This is what you're to do now in service to me. And that's what the law, in essence, is. And then there's blessings and curses. If you're faithful to keep this covenant, here's what you stand to benefit. And if you violate covenant, here's the curses that will fall on you. If you want to read about those, I'd encourage you to look at Deuteronomy 28, where those are laid out explicitly. Here are the blessings for keeping covenant with God. And this is what's going to happen to you, not if you break it, but when you break it. There's also always a public reading of the covenant treaty, and the treaty is deposited, copies of it, in a temple, which again you have when the stones that the 10 Commandments are written on are deposited in the Ark of the Covenant, which is kept in the tabernacle. So this Mosaic Covenant follows very closely the Hittite Suzerain treaties that you see in the ancient Near East, but it also goes beyond them. The Mosaic Covenant uses this form, but it breaks from it too, because Israel is far more than just a vassal. They're far more than God's servants and slaves. They're his treasured possession. They're his people. And God is more than a king to them. He's also their father. So there's a more intimate relationship evident in the Mosaic Covenant than there is in a typical suzerain treaty. I think it's really important to notice that the law, which is most of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right, is the detailing. There's narrative in there too, but there's lots of law, case law, apodactic law, lots of law being given. But law is a concept that fits into the framework of covenant. But covenant is a bigger concept. Part of covenant is law, but law isn't the sum total of covenant. I think that's really important to notice. There's a few misconceptions when we, especially as Protestants, look at the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law. I think too often we look at law in the Old Testament as a way that the Israelites were supposed to earn God's favor and work for their salvation. And that is really turning it on its head. When you read Exodus, when you read the preamble to this covenant, it is so clear that grace precedes law. The Exodus happens before the giving of the Ten Commandments, right? They're called through Abraham, Jacob, Joseph. They're called to be God's people, and they're redeemed miraculously, not because they obeyed. Their obedience is supposed to flow out of this prior grace. I think too often we read the Pharisees back into the Old Testament, and we think that the legalism of the Pharisees was what Old Testament religion was all about. And that's not true. That's a corruption of Old Testament religion. Even in the Old Testament, grace is there. We usually think of Old Testament as law and New Testament as grace. That is not helpful because there is plenty of grace in the Old Testament. In fact, grace precedes law. Law flows out of grace. And that's the same paradigm you see in the New Testament. There's plenty of law. There's plenty of commandments in the New Testament as well. But like the Old Testament, they flow out of grace. They're our response to God's grace. They're the way we keep our vocation. So I think we gotta get over those misconceptions of the law. The law was incredibly important, but not as a way of earning salvation, not as a way of establishing covenant. Covenant was established and law was a part of it, but law didn't establish covenant with God or relationship with God. The law is important. I don't want to diminish that. The patriarchs knew that they were supposed to obey God. Frankly, even pagan kings knew that some things were right and wrong, right? King Abimelech thinks lying is wrong and that taking someone else's wife from them is wrong. That's natural law. That has been a part of God's creation since the beginning. Here at Sinai, that natural law is codified in the Ten Commandments, and then additional laws about how the people were supposed to worship and how they were supposed to govern themselves as a nation are implemented. But law has always been a part of God's world. The patriarchs knew that. Adam and Eve were called to image God in his creation. And here the law shows what obedience looks like. The law details what it means to take the image of God and transcribe it onto his world in an appropriate way. The law nourishes our covenant relationship with God, and it should be seen as a privilege, not a burden. When we talk about, we're freed from the law, yes, we're freed from it, but not free of it. Matter of fact, part of the new covenant that we're in is that God would inscribe the law on our hearts. Not that he'd do away with it entirely. Luther and Calvin had slightly different views on the law. Both saw law in New Testament and Old Testament. Luther said that the law fences off sin for society. It has a kind of societal use and helps us determine laws and what actions ought to be illegal and frowned upon in this establishment kind of stuff. So it fences sin off. And it also serves as a tutor to guide us to Christ. The law exposes our sinfulness and predisposes us to be willing to receive or plead for grace that comes in Jesus Christ. Calvin said, yes, that's true. It fences off sin. That's the civil use of law. It guides us to Christ. But there's a third use of the law. The third use of the law is that it trains us in holiness. The use of the law that's the use of the law that would allow Israel to be this kingdom of priests, to be a holy people. The law was supposed to guide them, and it's supposed to guide us, the church, in that vocation. So the law is still incredibly important. I don't want to diminish it at all. Okay, next week I am going to talk more about the covenant of Sinai and the land and the conditional elements of the covenant, because I think we have to get a better grasp of that. But when we think about Exodus and Sinai, we've talked about it briefly, what things emerge? What kind of, at least to me, what pops out from the page and are lessons that we need to carry with us? And one of the first things that I notice in these texts is God and his presence is wonderful and terrifying. Theologians have sometimes referred to the mysterium tremendum, the mystery of God that inspires awe and trembling. I think maybe we neglect that aspect of God. We want God's presence. We sing about God's presence. We pray for God's presence. I don't know if we're ready to tremble at God's presence. When you look at Exodus, God's a fearsome God. He appears in fire to Moses in the burning bush. He appears as a pillar of fire to guide the Israelites at night. He's an avenging death angel. He's a God who brings plagues. He's a God who promises to consume and to punish if we aren't faithful. God is present, and that is a wonderful privilege. Matter of fact, later in Israel's life, they're told, you're going to the promised land. I'm giving it to you, but I'm not going with you, God says. And the people say, if you don't go with us, we don't want to go. Your presence is that important to us. But here in Exodus, you see that it's also a terrifying thing. I think we got to recover some of that. Something else we see in the story of Exodus, and I didn't really highlight it as much as I maybe should have, is kind of a compatibilistic view of human freedom. When you read through Moses' interactions with Pharaoh, there's this phrase that is repeated over and over and over and over again with slight variations. And it refers to the hardness of Pharaoh's heart. Who was it that was hardening Pharaoh's heart? Well, a lot of times the text says Pharaoh hardened his heart. Sometimes it comes in a passive voice. His heart was hardened. But there are many times in these first 14 chapters of Exodus where it's clear that God is the one doing the hardening. So in Exodus 4:21 and 7:3, God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that I can multiply my signs and wonders. I'm going to be glorified in Pharaoh. I'm going to do that by hardening his heart. Exodus 9:12, it's also the same thing. The Lord hardened the Pharaoh's heart. 7 more times in chapters 10 to 14, we see that it's God doing the hardening. And yet, the text also says Pharaoh hardened his heart. How do you balance those two things? That God's the one doing the hardening and Pharaoh is the one who is hardening his own heart. Those are difficult, but only if you have a mutually exclusive kind of view of human freedom. I don't. I think something can be ordained and chosen freely. I think Pharaoh was hardening his heart by giving himself over to sin, and God was saying, I'm giving you over to your sin. I'm hardening your heart. Both are legitimate biblical categories, and they work together. And you see that in the life of Pharaoh, which becomes something that the Apostle Paul will play on when he talks about objects of wrath. God was handing Pharaoh over to his own sin, and that was according to God's predetermined plan, because Pharaoh was an object of ignoble purposes that God had designed to display his wrath. Okay, the third and final lesson has to do with the whole topic of this series. The whole topic of this series is following the golden thread, and where do we see Jesus in this story? And you clearly see him in the Exodus, right? The Exodus becomes the biblical paradigm for redemption. God redeeming his people. In this Exodus event, you see deliverance from enemies. They're delivered from Pharaoh and miraculously delivered from his armies, which points ahead to even greater deliverance from our even more dreadful enemy, Satan. God delivers us in the person of Jesus Christ from our great enemy, Satan, and death and sin. But you also see its deliverance is freedom from bondage. The people of Israel were slaves, and they were freed by God's miraculous working. And we are slaves in our sin until we are liberated through our deliverer, Jesus Christ. And you see in this passage that salvation also equates to deliverance from wrath. God was venting his wrath on the people of Egypt. Being saved meant being saved from that wrath, even being saved in the midst of God's pouring out wrath. They weren't removed entirely from the scenes of frogs and locusts and things like that, but they were saved in the midst of God's displays of wrath. And Jesus Christ, through his sacrifice, saves us ultimately from God's wrath by absorbing it, by suffering the wrath of God for us. Next week, again, we will talk more about the covenant of Sinai, the conditional nature, and the land that goes along with that, and how Israel was supposed to be the people of God. Andrew, thanks for your comments. I appreciate that encouragement. And really important to remember, grace comes before law. If you get those inverted, you slide into Pharisaism, you slide into legalism really quickly. So grace comes before the law, and what a great way to go into the Christmas season, remembering the grace that comes to us through Jesus Christ. Hope you have a great Christmas. Enjoy the time with your family. Remember Jesus. Amen. Have a great day.